Good afternoon. Well, here I am. I'm speaking to you from St. John Stevensville United Church, the church where I serve as part of a team ministry with my wife, Cheryl. In the sanctuary with me today is John Bedell, who's my tech guy, and who has been very gracious in giving me a little bit of time today to put this presentation together. I'm going to be speaking to you about Andre Trocme's book, Jesus and the Nonviolent Revolution. Originally published in 1961 and published in French, the first English edition was put out in 1973, so 12 years after its original authoring. And then the edition that I'm using today is the 2003 Plough Publishing House edition, which interestingly incorporates some of the material from The Politics of Repentance, which was Trocme's first book, published in 1953. So we're getting a little bit of a compendium of his work. So Andre Trocme, the person, was born in April 7th, 1901. And he died on June 5th, 1973, just a short time after the book was first published in English. When World War I broke out, he was 13 years old, and so he experienced the reality of war through his teen years. At that time, he developed his being as a pacifist and a Christian socialist. In 1917, towards the end of the war, he and his family were evacuated to Belgium, the south of Belgium, where they lived as refugees until they were able to return home to France. Trocme studied theology at Sorbonne, and then he received a scholarship to go to Union Theological Seminary for 1 year. And so he was then ordained as a Reformed minister. And because of his pacifist stance, it was really hard for him to find a place to be settled, a call. But just before World War II broke out, he was sent to the community of Le Chambon-sur-Lignon, which is a community in France. And so there he was able to put forth his theology, who he was, and the way he approached the gospel. So between 1940 and 1945, so once World War II had broken out, Trocme's theology, his philosophy, his way of life, his way of being really came to the fore. And he, as a pacifist and one who believed that the gospel was to be lived out in the moment, so he convinced, through his preaching and the preaching of his partner in ministry, convinced the people of Le Chambon to begin harboring Jewish refugees. And so between 2000, or between 40 and 45, 1940 and 1945, between 2,000 and 4,500 Jewish refugees were sheltered in Le Chambon. They confronted first the French National Police and then the Nazi Gestapo, and throughout the war, they refused to turn over any Jews. And at one point, Trocme was asked where the Jews were, and he responded to the German interrogator that he didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't know any Jews, he only knew people. Interesting story about that, and I'll get into the book in a minute, but an interesting story about that is when the police or the Gestapo were coming into the community, all of the Jews would flee into the forest around the village. And when the coast was clear, the village people would move out into the forest themselves, and they would start singing the hymns of the church. And that would be an indication to the Jews who were in hiding that it was safe to once again come out. Because of their efforts, the town of Le Chambon was awarded the honor, the righteous among the righteous among the nations, which is an honor bestowed by the nation of Israel to those non-Jews who were instrumental during the Holocaust. This was an honor that had already been received by Andre Trocme, and his wife Magda had also received it on her own. So, to the book. The foreword, or the introduction to the book, was written by Charles Moore. And Charles Moore, a few things that Charles Moore said in the introduction. He said that Trocme's core argument is simple. Jesus inaugurated the kingdom of God based on the Jubilee principles of the Old Testament. These principles call for a political, economic, and spiritual revolution in response to human need. Jesus intended nothing less than a revolution, with debts forgiven, slaves set free, and land returned to the poor. Because of this approach, because this was what Jesus was about, it was this threat, the threat of living out the Jubilee. It was a threat to vested interests that awakened the hostility toward Jesus and eventually led to the cross. Jesus' way transcended the alternatives of his day. So there were alternatives, while at the same time it grew out of intense interaction with his contemporaries. He had to overcome the temptation of employing violence and of escaping into the desert, which would have been the two extreme reactions, but he was also challenged to not compromise. By showing us how Christ continues to do his work here and now through his people. So the work of Christ continues now through his people. Trocme broadens our understanding of Jesus' mission and makes plain what Jesus expected of his followers. In his introduction to the book, Trocme makes a few points that I think are really important to kind of hold before us as we enter into the conversation. Trocme says the tendency of Christians to intellectualize ethical issues is in direct proportion to the extent that they have become part of the power establishment. That seems pretty harsh, but it's how he approaches this conversation. He also says that whether one believes that he is the Son of God or not, so regardless of whether you believe that Jesus is the Son of God or not, Jesus is the central event of history, because de facto his coming changed humankind. So for everybody, de facto, Jesus' coming changes humankind. The Jesus of history actually transcends both the Old and the New Testament. He is the point of encounter between two theological edifices. Trocme continues that Jesus' life and teaching are a bridge connecting two historical epochs, a bridge defined by the parables and aphorisms which he spoke. Their depth is more striking than any rigorously consistent doctrine, for they spring from the presence of Jesus, or the presence in Jesus, of the living God, who reveals himself as the loving Father of all people. God's presence manifests itself. It does not prove itself. It doesn't have to. But if you hear there, that regardless of what doctrines we might kind of espouse and try and communicate, the parables and aphorisms which Jesus spoke defined the bridge between these two, between what was before and what comes after. And here Trocme says, the theses concerning the proclamation of a biblical jubilee. So his book is really about the biblical jubilee being the centerpiece of what Jesus was about. And not only that, but that is the nonviolent revolution that Trocme is referring to or talking about in the book. The idea of a biblical jubilee. But he says the theses concerning the proclamation of a biblical jubilee by Jesus are entirely his own. If their somewhat unusual character can stimulate the curiosity of the specialists and provoke further inquiry into the social ethics and nonviolence of Jesus, then he says, I have attained my goal. So a couple of things. Trocme is very clear. He is not an academic. Trocme is a pastor. And he's a pastor to a particular group of people. And he is speaking out of that reality. He is speaking out of that context. And he sees in Jesus the same kind of role. That Jesus is a pastor, that he is a shepherd. He is communicating with his own flock. What Trocme says in this book, some of it would be considered quite controversial. I happen to agree with much of what he says. I found very little that I didn't agree with. I found it extremely enlightening, and so I offer that as a bit of a reflection as I enter into the book. The book is divided into 3 sections. So part 1, Jesus and the Revolution, is broken up into 5 chapters. Part 2 is Jesus and his contemporaries, and part 3 is Jesus and revolutionary nonviolence, and we'll come to those parts shortly. But Trocme starts with the idea that first and foremost, Jesus is a Jew. And Jesus does not argue against the idea that the Jewish people are a people divinely chosen and set apart. That their nationhood, their being, is defined by God. And as divinely chosen by God, the nation of Israel is held to a higher expectation than the nations around them. And then Jesus said, or Trocme says that with Jesus coming, Jesus actually, it's not that the Jews are removed, but the church of Jesus Christ, or the Christian church, is now also recognized as a divinely chosen people. And the expectations on us is greater than those around us. By proclaiming Jesus as Messiah, by wearing the mantle of Christian, we are taking upon ourselves the mission, the life, the work of Jesus Christ. That is part of Trocme's thesis. He puts that forward to us in a very clear way. And what is that mission? That mission is found in the proclamation of the Jubilee. So if we remember, if you think about Luke 4, so on the right-hand side of the screen, Luke 4, 16 to 20, the Spirit of the Lord is on me because God has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor, has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Trocme reminds us that when Jesus reads that passage in the synagogue, he is reading the words of Isaiah. And they are words that set forth an agenda. And Trocme says that agenda is not only spiritual, is not only economic, it's political. It is all of those pieces tied in together. So what does the Jubilee entail? Is one of the questions that comes up. The Jubilee, and it is not something that is to be desired for in the future. The Jubilee is something that is here and now, and it is laid out in that passage. Now, there's all kinds of debate about whether the Jubilee was actually practiced or not, and actually, Trocme suggests, or part of his argument is that it was not practiced for the most part. So if we think about the Jubilee, so every 7 years, there was a 7-year rotation. And in that 7-year rotation, all of these pieces were supposed to be enacted. The poor were supposed to be forgiven their debt. Prisoners were supposed to be freed from their captivity, or from their oppression, or from their responsibility that had brought them into slavery and prison and being a prisoner. The idea, Jesus sort of saying that the blind will be, or the sight for the blind, that those who could not see in the past would be given the opportunity to see what was really happening in front of them. The only thing that it looks like the only thing that really was practiced in the sense of Jubilee was that the land was laid fallow every 7 years. That resulted in hardship actually for some, but that's an aside. But what Jesus is doing in this moment, Trocme argues, is he is setting forth this as an agenda. That this is something that is expected to be lived out today, in the moment, that prisoners would actually be let free, that the oppressed would really have the oppression lifted off of them, that the poor were truly hearing good news. And so this is laying forth something that is not to be, it's not a spiritual concept in Trocme's mind. In the way that Trocme hears the words of Jesus at that moment, it is something that is now to be enlivened. And he says, it's not surprising that this would be good news to the poor, it would be well received by the poor, but it would be considered threatening by those in positions of wealth and power. The idea, Trocme looks at the politics of the day, and he looks at, this was actually kind of a surprise to me. When I read this chapter, Trocme finishes it by letting us know that the kingdom of Israel, or the nation of Israel, was a collection of small individual towns. So they weren't really, and each one of them would have had their own leadership. And so what I have always conceived as kind of a nation, as I conceive Canada, is actually not, each one of them would have had particular requirements. Taxation would not have been universal. Things like poll taxes and road taxes, and they would have been different depending on where you lived and how close, sometimes how close you were to Jerusalem. The Romans, he kind of lays out this map where part of Israel, part of the nation, is ruled by procurators, and that would be Pontius Pilate, and other parts were not. So the Herodians, Herod, was actually in the same sort of role as Pilate, but in a different region of the nation. It was that was really kind of an eye-opener to me, but also gives a little bit of sense. It makes the trial of Jesus on Good Friday, it makes a little bit more sense as we think about how that went back and forth. In section 2, in part 2, Jesus and his contemporaries. So Trocme looks at the precursors, what he calls the precursors to peace. And so in this section, he outlines the words of the prophets. So he looks at the prophetic history of Israel. He looks at the Old Testament prophecies around, not necessarily around Jesus, but around the Jubilee, around what are the expectations of the people of Israel when it comes to things like the land and how they treat their strangers in their community, how they are to treat the poor, etc., etc. Remembering that the bar that is held by God for them is higher because they are the chosen people in covenant, and so they know what God is asking of them. They're aware, it's been communicated to them, and yet they are not meeting it. But so Jesus looks at the prophets and how the prophets challenged the nation, how the prophets challenged the leaders of the land, and how Jesus then becomes the next part of that voice. He also looks at a more violent part of the past. So he looks at the Maccabees, and he kind of unpacks some of that history that leads to the point in history where Jesus is now here, standing as the bridge, remember, between those two epochs. The crisis in Palestine, he looks at where things stood. So the level of oppression that was being meted out, not only by the Romans, but by the religious leaders as well. And so the crisis that Trocme is looking at is the extreme oppression that is being experienced by the general populace, and there are layers of oppression that is being meted out. And so Trocme says this is where things were at that moment. So then the seeds of nonviolence, or resistance movements, sorry. So Trocme looks at all of the pieces that were happening. So how were different groups within that context relating with their oppressors and with each other. And so he looks at how the Pharisees are kind of holding up religious fervor, whereas the Sadducees were in league at times with the Roman oppressors. The Herodians as well. So he's looking at all of these different pieces of how each of these groups is relating to the Romans who are there, but also how they're relating to each other and how they're relating to the wider community. So Jesus looks at the realities, and he proposes another way. Now, it wasn't easy, and I don't know about you, but when I read the Gospels, or when I read the Gospels, I'd say it's changing. It's been changing for a while, but in an earlier time, it all just seems so easy. It seems so easy that things just unfolded, right? So like it's something as simple as when Jesus called the disciples, they dropped their nets and they followed him. Well, I think it's more complicated than that. I think all of these pieces are more complicated than we might first imagine. And so when Jesus considers another way, Trocme takes us back to the temptations in the desert. Trocme takes us back to the temptations in the desert because what he says is that, Jesus is confronted with a reality that says if he wants to do something, he can. He can. So he doesn't need to, so Jesus, in Trocme's argument, Jesus does not have to withdraw to the desert. Jesus does not have to engage in violent revolution or rebellion. Because what Jesus could do is Jesus could choose just to feed everybody. Jesus could choose to bring peace to all of the nations just by, if he exercised his birthright, or actually probably not his birthright, but his divine right to be God. And so if we go back to the temptations, the devil or the tempter says to Jesus, "Why? Look, here's all of the kingdoms of the world. They're yours if you will worship me." Trocme says, so here, if we look at that and we look at that temptation, Jesus could be the ruler of the world if he would exercise that right or that power. Or Jesus could feed everybody in the world if he would exercise the power. Take this stone and turn it into a loaf of bread. And Trocme looks at those and says that those temptations are lived out on a number of occasions through Jesus' life as he contemplates how he is going to respond to the realities around him. He also says that there are moments in the Gospels where Jesus is really close. Where Jesus is really, the feeding of the 5,000 is one of those places where Trocme says, Jesus kind of it became a possibility at that moment. He also says that there were times in the gospel accounts where Jesus contemplated using violence, but that when these temptations came forward into his life, Jesus made the choice, the decision to not act in that way, to be more concerned about the coming of God's kingdom and recognizing that the coming of God's kingdom was going to take time, that it was not something that could be brought in the immediate, and that by doing that, he honored the individuality of each human being and our collective power of choice and self-realization. So then, in Jesus and the Revolutionary Nonviolence, so part 3, this is where it sort of comes to full force. So the radical explosion that Trocme is talking about is the fact that so if we remember that Jesus was a Jew, he felt himself, or he understood himself as coming to the people of Israel. He sent his disciples out to speak to the Jews, not to the Gentiles, etc. So that was how we began. That's how the story began. But gradually, it comes to a point where there is this, what Trocme calls a radical explosion, where it becomes understood that it is not simply for the people of Israel, that it is for Gentiles, and it is for Samaritans, and it is for the Romans, and it is for everybody who at that time couldn't even have been conceived of. But at that, there's a moment, there's a progression in the gospel account where the message moves from being for the people of Israel to everybody. This Sunday I preached on John 3:16, and I just really embraced the idea that God so loved the world that God sent God's Son. Here, Trocme sees the expansion of the message, the radical explosion of the message of Jesus Christ into something that is meant for the entire world, transcending geography, transcending time even. But that brings a problem though, and that is where in chapter 12, the Sword of the Spirit, he talks about how that realization and the living out of that understanding of the gospel leads to division with a number of groups that really could have been considered allies. And so Trocme talks about the disputes, the open disputes with the Pharisees, and how Jesus becomes more and more and more challenging towards the Jewish leadership as he moves the message beyond the people of Israel. And Trocme says that Jesus actually instigates. So he's purposeful in doing so. That he pushes it and pushes it so that that kind of conflict is necessary. It's a necessary piece of the story. But he says that it's also necessary to Jesus' message because the Pharisees and the Jewish leadership of the time were really concerned with the law and living into the law, whereas Jesus is much more concerned with the person and how the law serves the person. This becomes this is brought to kind of a head when Trocme gives a really interesting read on the parable or the healing of the person with the crippled hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And Trocme says, goes through that story and unpacks it as Jesus putting one person ahead of everything else. So one person is not only ahead of the law, but one person is ahead of the mission that Jesus is here to do. Because the mission, in Trocme's estimation, or the way he speaks about it, nonviolence is a very personal thing. It's not about not taking up arms. Nonviolence is about how we treat each other in the day-to-day pieces, and how we make choices for the just treatment of individuals in our lives, whether we know them or not. That, of course, comes to the next chapter, and that being the greatest commandment. So, Trocme looks at Mark 12, and that would be the next slide, John. Trocme looks at Mark 12, where Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And his response is, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these. Trocme reminds us that this isn't new, that this isn't a new message. That part of it is found in Deuteronomy, love the Lord your God. Part of it is found in Leviticus, love your neighbor as yourself. What Jesus does, and what makes it radical, is that Jesus brings the two together. Now, Trocme argues or suggests that this is something new, that this is something that Jesus alone does. So we don't know. I don't know if it had ever been done before, but this is a moment in history where the people are challenged to think about how they treat their neighbor, how they love their neighbor is a reflection or an indication of how they love or how they treat God. So I have preached on that, but Trocme really he kind of lays it out and pulls in various pieces to kind of really make the point and to make it very pointedly. In the politics of witness, he challenges the individual. He challenges the individual to be intentional, about how we engage with the story and how we share the story. He also suggests that when confronted, that we act with conscience, not concession. He says that concession is not. Now remember, and this is why it's really important to remember where he's coming from. He's just experienced 2 world wars in his lifetime. He's seen the cost of concession, and I think that really colors how he views the immediacy of the message of Jesus. He also he does this really interesting piece as well around Gandhi. So Mahatma Gandhi, he draws a comparison between Jesus and Gandhi and the way that they interacted with their communities, the way they confronted authority, and he sees a whole lot of parallel. He does draw a few differences, though. The big one being that Gandhi is not God incarnate. But he also says that Jesus' role or his goal was not the removal of Romans from the country and the removal of that oppression. Jesus' mission and his goal was the kingdom of God, which transcended that. Whereas Gandhi's was definitely the liberation of his nation, which he achieved. They both met with violent ends. But what Trocme suggests is that Gandhi's life, the way he lived his life, was a proof that the Beatitudes, that the message that Jesus offers in the Beatitudes, that the message of liberation, the message of Luke 4, that it is possible to live that and to live it with success. And finally, we get to the chapter on God's history. And so there's the sense that this is a progression moving forward. He reminds us that we are to engage with history faithfully. He says, to my knowledge, all the religious, philosophical, political doctrines that affirm the inevitable use of violence also acknowledge that it is secondary. Violence is only a means of reaching a desirable end, justice and peace, but peace is non-violence. In this sense, all agree. So the idea that sure, in history we have seen people who have wanted peace, who have wanted justice, who have engaged violently. But the end is that violence begets violence. The only way forward to truly live out the gospel of Jesus Christ, according to Trocme, is to engage in what he calls the nonviolent revolution, but which is the living out of the Jubilee aspirations of the people of Israel. The Jubilee aspirations that were proclaimed and communicated by Jesus in Luke 4, but also on the in the Sermon on the Mount, to hold these pieces before us and to act accordingly, and to not succumb to the temptations for an easy fix today, when we know that there will be great cost tomorrow. So like I say, I loved this book. I think that Trocme is a wonderful, communicates a wonderful way of understanding the gospel and of living life. And in case we think that it's really nice on paper and theoretically, we have to remember that he, in the midst of some of the most violent times in our history, he lived out the aspirations of which he writes. If you want to know a little bit more about Andre Trocme and his wife Magda and the community at Le Chambon, I would encourage you to take a look at the link that is now on the screen. It's a link to a YouTube channel, which gives a little bit of the history when Trocme received the Righteous Among the Nations honor. This was a video that was put together for that moment. And so with that, my presentation on Jesus and the Nonviolent Revolution is now come to a conclusion. Thank you.